In this screencast, we're going to compare the monopsony and the perfectly competitive labor market. We're going to draw the two firms throughout the screencast. So you're going to need to stop the screencast as you're going along to be able to do the steps that are provided. And while we are comparing it, we'll first draw the monopsony graph, and then we will look at the perfectly competitive graph and compare it to it. And while we are comparing, we're going to look at the amount of workers that are hired and also the wage rates that are paid between these two labor markets. So for step one, we need to draw and label the axes of a monopsony graph. So pause the screencast and follow step one. What you can see when you draw and label the axes of the monopsony graph is the vertical axis is the wage rate and the horizontal axis is the quantity of laborers. Step two, draw and label the MRP and the demand for labor curves. So pause the screencast and follow step two. When you're drawing the demand for labor curve, it's equal to the MRP, the marginal revenue product of labor. It is downward sloping. The demand for a resource is derived from the demand of the product it produces. There's two things that affect the MRP, productivity and product price. Whether we're talking about the monopsony or we're talking about the perfectly competitive firm, both of them have the downward sloping demand curve. And when we're looking at the marginal physical product, which is part of the formula for the MRP, of MRP equals marginal physical product times the product price, that's where we're looking at that diminishing returns, which is creating this downward sloping component of the demand curve. Step three, draw and label the MRC and the supply curves for the monopsony graph. So pause the screencast and follow step three. When we're drawing the MRC and the supply curves, they're not equal to one another for the monopsony. The supply curve in a monopsony is upward sloping because of the willingness and ability of suppliers of labor to increase the quantity supplied as the wage rate goes up. The MRC is greater than the supply curve because in a monopsony, in order to increase the number of workers, you have to pay a higher wage rate, right? Quantity supplied goes up as wage rate goes up. But you don't just increase the wage rate for the additional worker, you increase the wage rate for all previous workers also. Think about it. We don't want to lose the productivity of the previous workers, and if we're paying them a lower wage rate than the additional worker, then they may not be as productive as before. And so everybody is paid this new and higher wage rate that this additional worker has received. So as a result, you have an MRC that is greater than the supply curve. Step four. Label the quantity of workers hired in the monopsony and the wage rate of the monopsony. So pause the screencast and follow step four. The formula that we use when we're looking at the amount of workers that is hired is MRC equals MRP. You draw a line straight down and that gives you the quantity of workers that is hired within the monopsony. The trick here is when you're figuring out the wage rate. When you're figuring out the wage rate, remember that supply equals the wage rate. This is people's willingness and ability to work at the different wages. And so if we're at a quantity here, this is the wage rate that people would be willing and able to work. And so therefore, you take at MRC equals MRP, you take it down to the supply curve, and that gives you the wage rate that the firm will be paying. Step five. Now we're going to add the perfectly competitive firm to this monopsony graph. If it helps you at all in remembering that, think about the perfectly competitive firm. They're wage takers. They're taking the price from the wage rate from the industry. And so when we're thinking about when we're drawing a perfectly competitive firm and market, it's that side by side, where for the market or the industry, you have the supply and the demand curve that's giving you that wage rate. And so recognize that here you have a supply and demand curve that you can use in order to take the wage rate from. So pause the screencast and follow step 5. So as a wage taker then, you're going where that intersection of supply and demand meet. And that is giving you the equilibrium price for this perfectly competitive firm. Here you have workers that are all the same. There's so many firms out there that they can work at that if this one is not willing and able to pay the wage rate that the market is giving, then they can easily find it somewhere else. We're usually dealing with more of an unskilled type of labor market. And so with that, you have a perfectly elastic supply curve. The supply is equal to the MRC. And that then is giving you this wage rate of the perfectly competitive firm. When you're looking at the quantity then, you're just drawing your line down, and that's giving you the quantity of workers that is hired for the perfectly competitive firm. When you're comparing the perfectly competitive to the monopsony, you will always find that the wage rate for the perfectly competitive firm is always higher than the wage rate for the monopsony, because your supply equals your MRC instead of your MRC being greater than your supply curve. The quantity of workers that is hired in the perfectly competitive firm is always larger than the quantity of workers that is hired in the monopsony. So again, when you're comparing the two, remember about supply and demand giving you that wage taker for the perfectly competitive firm, so that way then you can create your perfectly elastic supply curve. The quantity of workers hired is always greater for the perfectly competitive firm than the monopsony, and the wage rate is always higher for the perfectly competitive firm than the monopsony.